Welcome to the Depression to Expression podcast. Do I have an episode for you, the first neuroscientist on the podcast? Okay, if you want answers about how to deal with depression in a different way through functional medicine, through nutrition and diet, here is a story, here is a success story for you. Matt speaks so eloquently as to why and how eating certain foods actually affects our brains and our bodies. This is a podcast that everyone, I believe, needs to listen to. Matt Janes needs to get out there way more and explore and release this new narrative to the world. Because, listen, depression is a horrible, horrible thing to go through. And I can speak from experience on that one. But let me tell you a little secret. And if you follow me on YouTube and all other platforms, you already know this little thing. But after 12 years of being on antidepressants, I am now medication-free. That's right. And what Matt talks about in this podcast, I've adapted to my own life. And I got off antidepressants without tapering, with virtually no real withdrawal symptoms. Because we all have heard those horror stories of withdrawal and people not being able to get off medication. Matt has been a massive resource for me through this journey, which is why I'm so happy and pumped to have him on the podcast to explain to all the listeners, all of you, how this actually works, why diet has such a profound impact on our mental health, how he cured depression, and how he helped his dad so much. And he documents this in his book called Saving Dad. This is just going to be an incredible experience for everyone. Your mind may be blown, but let's take some deep breaths together because this is all new. It's a new narrative around mental illness and mental health. So hold on tight, buckle up. It might be a bumpy one, but we're going to get through it together, I promise. Now, as you all know, this podcast is ad-free due to the selfless supporters and members of Depression to Expression. Now, if you're interested in hearing more of Matt Janes, there's another 40 minutes of him and I chatting back and forth really about my personal situation of getting off antidepressants. Well, members get that exclusive footage as well as weekly meditation live streams, monthly live streams with the entire community, and of course exclusive videos of how I'm doing with this whole nutrition and life change. And it's just one heck of an experience that I really want to share with those that support this overall mission of Depression to Expression. So if you're interested, of course, the link is in the bio. Now I'm done chatting. Here is Matt Janes, healing the world of depression through nutrition. Matt Janes, welcome to the Depression to Expression podcast. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Oh, you're welcome. Good to see you, Scott.
Good to see you too. I'm really excited because you are the first neuroscientist on the podcast. I know, a lot of pressure from me. I want to make sure I have some really good questions here.
Yeah, make them good.
Make them good.
Don't waste it.
Well, let's start at the beginning here. How and why did you get into neuroscience? Because we'll speak about this throughout the podcast. There's mental illness in your family, especially depression.
Yeah.
Was that a motivator behind your studies?
Absolutely.
Okay.
So I've had a huge turnaround. I used to be a corporate guy, but working in big glass offices in London.
Yeah.
And now I'm northwest of England in Liverpool. But to give people a backstory, my dad has been suffering with very severe depression on and off since I was 3. And believe it or not, I'm 47 now. So it's been over 4 decades. And during that time, he's been hospitalized 7 times in psychiatric hospital. He's had hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of courses of electric shock therapy, ECT. Every antidepressant, antipsychotic you can think of has been thrown at him, but he's drug resistant. So yeah, the reason I studied neuroscience was to finally, after 4 decades, put some kind of skin on the bones as to what goes on in somebody, in the brain of somebody that's suffering so much from mental illness, like my dad. He's actually bipolar. So I was running an e-commerce business at the time, and I sold that. We can come on to this later, but I've had 3 depressive episodes myself. And I got to the point where I was struggling and decided, right, it's time. It's time to get rid of the business. And the proceeds from the business sale allowed me to take time out and to repurpose and restudy. So that's when I went back and did my neuroscience studies, plus mental health psychology and functional medicine and all this other kind of stuff. But it was very much with the view that I wanted to understand my dad's suffering that I'd seen so much over the years, and as importantly, help other people too.
So I know you wrote an incredible book called Saving Dad. Everyone links in bio. But is this where you really put in the journey of literally saving your dad through functional medicine, diet? We're going to get into all of that. Is this in the book, in this kind of journey?
Yeah, so it starts in the prologue with it's my earliest memory in life when I was 3, seeing Dad crying in Mum's arms in 1975. And it was his first depressive episode. And I chart the story of my dad's relationship with his mental illness and chart my journey alongside that. So, as I say, I've suffered from mental illness, depression 3 times. So it's a real roller coaster ride, and I really chart his journey. And being bipolar, of course, there's been some pretty exciting times too. Some things that will make raise a few eyebrows in the book from readers.
Okay, so why don't we jump right in? So your dad was hospitalized 7 times. He was most likely taking some fairly common drugs, pharmaceuticals that are meant to help this condition. So what have you learned through your studies and through helping people all over the world with your course, by working with them individually and working on yourself as well? What have you learned about healing depression?
There's an untold story. There's an untold story that people don't know about because the narrative isn't there. So at the same time that the first antidepressants were being developed in the 50s, there was something going on in a parallel universe, a group of doctors that were discovering that people that were unwell and in psychiatric hospitals, they had an imbalance in something called the autonomic nervous system. So this is all fallen out of the work that I've done with neuroscience and all the rest of it. Now, the autonomic nervous system is it's a series of nerves, muscles, and organs over which you have no conscious control. So it regulates things like your heartbeat, your blood pressure, things like that, without any input consciously. And it runs basically from the hypothalamus in the brain right down to your backside, and it controls all metabolism, and it controls many, many bodily processes. And what doctors found was, with the psychiatric patients, was that when they were unwell and they tested their autonomic nervous system, which you do through a blood pressure injection, they found that it was out of balance. So there's 2 branches to this nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic branch. And in people that were unwell, so whether that be schizophrenia or depression, they would be out of balance. So one branch would be heavily dominant. And then when they were retested, when they recovered from their illness, they were back in balance. So that gave the hypothesis that, is mental illness down to an imbalance in this nervous system, which controls everything, hormones, neurotransmitters, everything. So several doctors in history have built upon this knowledge, and it just hasn't got the airtime because, well, quite frankly, there's no revenue stream associated with it. So pharmaceutical companies don't benefit from it. You can do something called reflex tuning. So there was a doctor in the 50s called Dr. Gellhorn, and he talked about reflex tuning, so tuning this nervous system back into balance. And one of the ways you do that is through nutrition, diet. So if I just talk about my dad's last hospital admission, he was very, very sick. This is early 2019. And he got to the stage that for his safety, he had to be hospitalized. Now, through my knowledge of neuroscience and learning about this system, I began to become aware that there was a way of getting somebody ill, like my dad, without traditional approaches to psychiatry. So the classic response whenever dad went into hospital was give him a new set of drugs, polypharmacy, 3 drugs, 4 drugs piled on top of each other. But as a family, we knew from 4 decades worth of experience, he just didn't respond. So every single time when dad went into hospital, he needed electric shock therapy to get him out of hospital. And he needed a minimum of 12. And that's on a general anesthetic. So you're having at most 2 general anesthetics and electric shocks a week. So heavy duty. So dad was in hospital, but he had 2 blood clots on his lungs. This was something they found out whilst he was in hospital. So they were unwilling to do ECT because of the risk to his health, because of the anesthetic. So we were left in a position where dad was hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital, but he couldn't have the only treatment that we knew would get him out of hospital because of these blood clots on his lungs. So he was stuck. So that sent me on a really deep dive to learn, okay, what the heck can we do? So I learned about this reflex tuning of the autonomic nervous system, then got really into the detail. And I learned about a doctor out of the States who was treating cancer very, very successfully using an alternative cancer protocol called Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez. And one of the 3 arms of this protocol was using nutrition to balance the autonomic nervous system, in addition to using digestive enzymes. So I knew there that there was a means of manipulating this nervous system. And according to the hypothesis of these doctors, back in the 50s and 60s, that somebody that's deeply unwell, like my dad, could be made to get better.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I completely agree. And it's just a matter of fact that the narrative, when people think mental illness and they think treatment, they think automatic. Okay, exercise is a big one. We can talk exercise. That's okay.
Yeah.
We can talk meditation, but we can talk therapy. But there's always the medication side in there. It's like it always goes hand in hand. And to be honest, Matt, I feel almost scared to speak out against the chemical imbalance narrative because people will think you're not empathetic, that you don't understand, that you haven't been through it. So that's why I have you on, so you can talk about it and I'm safe.
Yeah, indeed.
Yeah. So the whole chemical imbalance between the nervous system, you learned that through this reflex tuning and diet. This can be changed. So what happened next?
Yeah, so, well, you've mentioned a couple of interesting things there. So exercise does have an effect on our mental health, as you well know from experience. But the way that it does it, and nobody ever talked about this, exercise is one way of tuning the autonomic nervous system. So if someone is depressed and they go for a run, they excite, to use a neurological term, excite the sympathetic branch of this nervous system. So if someone is out of balance on the other side, which people that are depressed often are, it boosts the sympathetic branch and brings them into autonomic balance. And it does that by exciting neurotransmitters on the sympathetic branch. Now, however, yoga, meditation, that's another form of exercise. That does exactly the opposite. So that stimulates the parasympathetic branch. So someone in another group, another balance of the autonomic nervous system that wants to calm their nervous system. That's why yoga and meditation works, because it calms the sympathetic branch and boosts the parasympathetic branch, whereas fast exercise like running stimulates the sympathetic branch. So what you essentially do to sort of bring a big whole picture to people have a natural, genetically predisposed balance in this nervous system, and they fit into one of 3 groups. There's people in the middle that typically don't suffer with mental illness unless they're pushed under stress severely. So they're in the middle. And then on either side of that, you've got 2 groups. Let's call them group 1 and group 3. Group 1 have an overly active sympathetic branch, and group 3 have an overly active parasympathetic branch. So the group threes are the people that need to do the running and excite the other branch to bring them into balance. And the group ones need to do the meditation and the yoga to calm the sympathetic branch. So you're always looking for balance in this nervous system. And I use, in presentations that I do, I use a Weeble. I don't know if you know a toy from the 70s. You're probably too young.
What is it?
I've probably got one somewhere.
I'm good with my music from the 70s, but I don't know.
There you go.
Yeah.
So it basically a Weeble is something you rocks but never falls over. So it rocks back and forth, and it always comes back to center.
Okay.
Over time, it doesn't fall over. So it's a good way of showing that you can manipulate the nervous system. It's kind of an analogy to bring it back into upright, rather like the Weeble returns to upright. And there's things that you can do to bring that about. So one of the things is exercise, like we talked about. But another big one is nutrition. It's so important. And I know you had Michaela Peterson on, didn't you?
Yes, we can talk about that. But again, a part of the narrative is okay, it's medication, yes. Diet is rarely talked about, Matt. I swear to you, over the 7 years I've been on YouTube, a diet has never been part of the conversation when I'm like, okay, what have you tried? Diet, have you tried cutting this? Have you tried adding this? Have you tried this?
Yeah.
And it's not part of doctor's training, so can you necessarily blame them? So nutrition's a big one. Why don't we start there? The carnivore diet is curing everything these days.
So it's funny. So I saw Jordan's, Michaela's dad's video with Joe Rogan. Mm-hmm. And saw the fact that it fixed very severe depression with carnivore. And clearly Michaela has done the same, plus some other autoimmune disease, arthritis. So I sent Michaela a tweet or a message on Twitter and said, look, I know why this works. You guys are doing it, but you seemingly don't know why it works. But I do. So both Jordan Peterson and Michaela are group threes. They are parasympathetic dominant patients. So when they eat red meat contains loads of things that are great for people that are parasympathetic dominant because it stimulates the sympathetic nerves. Mm-hmm. So it contains tyrosine and phenylalanine, which are two precursors to the two specific neurotransmitters on the sympathetic branch. Well, hopefully this isn't getting too complicated for people. So by eating red meat, you stimulate the neurotransmitters specifically on the sympathetic branch, which is the one that you want to stimulate if you're a group 3. Like Michaela and Jordan are. Now, if you were a group 1 and you had red meat, it would make you worse. Now, it goes to explain why there's not one diet for everybody. So some people say, oh yeah, go carnivore. And people say, oh no, it didn't work for me. But people that, like a vegan or a carnivore that's very passionate about the thing that worked for them, they say, try it. It's the way forward. But everyone always assumes that there's only one diet. But there aren't. So there's 3 main groups of diet. There's carnivore for your parasympathetic dominance. There's vegetarian based, but not solely vegetarian for your group 1s. And then there's mix of the two for your balanced metabolizers that sit in the middle. So the process really is, first of all, you've got to identify which group you sit into. And then you can tailor your diet accordingly. So that's what I do with people, because most lay people wouldn't know instinctively what group they belong to. So I help them to do that.
How do you help someone decide whether, is there a blood test you can do, or is it just question and answer, lifestyle, the way you sleep? What kind of questions?
It's a combination, and there are several ways. So there is a hair test, which is just kind of black and white. I don't do that hair test. So I do it through a pretty deep dive on someone's personality. So their physiological profile, their personality, their traits, their physical appearance to some degree can give some guidance. But the most obvious thing is if someone's a natural type A personality, a real go-getter, need 4 or 5 hours sleep, run companies, run countries, politicians, the Margaret Thatchers and Ronald Reagans of this world, they're group 1s. So they are the sorts of people that would very rarely suffer from depression. So depression is typically a group 3 illness. So largely what we're doing with people that are depressed, we're boosting the sympathetic nerves. They've got weak sympathetic nerves and strong parasympathetic nerves. So you typically know that when someone comes in the door and they're suffering from depression, they're the people that we need to boost the sympathetic nerves, which is why we're seeing so much great progress being made with the carnivore diet. So there's all sorts of other things, aspartic and glutamic acid in red meat. And again, that boosts the sympathetic nerves. So there's a number of things in it, especially fatty red meat. So, and again, you're talking about, doctors training and what airtime nutrition gets. Just think about the hard time that saturated fat gets. We've been, certainly someone that grew up when I did in the 70s and 80s, fat was just like, don't go there. Everything had to be low fat yogurt, low fat this, skim milk, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
Your brain is 60% fat. It uses 25% of the body's energy. Your cells are made of fat. So you've got to fuel it. You've got to fuel it with fats. So what's happened, I think, over a period of the last few decades, is people have stripped out fats because they've been told that it's bad. And there was a guy called Ansel Keys in the 50s in America that told people that fats were bad. And he managed to influence US dietary guidelines. So now we've got a picture where most people eat carbs and they think that that's the right way to go. Well, it's a blooming disaster for your mental health.
So is there, depending on, parasympathetic or sympathetic, which balance you're on, can't we say that foods for both nervous systems are bad? So can we say, one shouldn't be eating this and the other shouldn't be eating this? Or there's some big no-nos for our diets?
Yes, the common denominator for all groups is that we're eating far too higher carbohydrate diets and sugar. So sugar in the form of refined sugars, which might be, hidden in foods, but also carbohydrate metabolizes as sugar in the body. So what we want to do is shift people from a carbohydrate burning diet to a fat-based burning diet. And people immediately think, oh no, I'll get, fat makes me fat. But I can assure you that it doesn't. We've just been told a narrative which isn't accurate, unfortunately. So fueling the brain with healthy fats. So for instance, in the morning, I will have ghee, I'll have coconut oil, nuts, avocado, feeding my brain as someone that's vulnerable to depression with the fuel that it needs to fuel my nervous system. You wouldn't put diesel in a petrol car and vice versa. And, we've got to fuel the brain correctly. So you might have heard people talk about the Mediterranean diet as being very good for depression. Now, there's two reasons why that is. One is because it strips out a lot of carb and then a lot of sugar. But secondly, it feeds the brain with EPA. So that's a form of omega-3. So a fat that's found in animals that fuels the brain. So that, that larger picture of Mediterranean diet is one subset of this autonomic nervous system issue that we're talking about. It's just that the biology doesn't seem to get mapped onto the recommendations. So people don't have the framework to understand why certain diets help some people and why some help others. It always tends to be, someone comes out with a new cookbook or a doctor comes out with a new thing and it's like, everyone go that way, Atkins or whatever it might be.
Right.
But people aren't usually given the framework to understand, well, why should I eat that? Why should I eat Mediterranean? Why should I eat carnivore? Why should I go vegetarian?
Right.
And this is why.
Well, the biggest thing today is people are getting the ideas, from influencers as well. That they'll see an influencer is eating this, they look great. Seinfeld did a joke. He's just like, I don't know what to eat. You just go up to someone that looks good. Okay, what are you eating? I'll just eat what you eat, right? Yeah. So it's about understanding. A few years ago, I did the ketogenic diet just as an experiment for 30 days. Yeah. And it was hell for the first few weeks. Yeah. But then, Matt, I started to feel a heck of a lot better because I was raised in a family of 7 of us. and
Wow.
you had to feed us carbs. It's like, you know what I
Yeah,
mean? But
just for economic reasons.
right. But understanding that fat isn't the enemy and that we need to fuel
Oh,
our
for sure.
brain is just
Absolutely.
one beautiful step in the right direction.
Yeah, it
Now,
really is.
can we go into, does this mean that since you know the power of food
Mm.
and understand this, does that mean that you could call yourself anti-psychiatry or anti-pharmaceutical? Do these drugs play a role? Can you do both?
Yeah, so they do play a role. So when you go to a GP, you know, I'm in the UK, you go to your GP and you're given a questionnaire to assess your mood to see whether you're suffering from, say, anxiety or depression. And that's really the limit to the diagnosis. And then you're given a recommended antidepressant. Now, the thing that, you know, if we go down the route of pharmacology, let's at least start to tailor the drug to the person. Now, that's totally possible. So let me show you this little device here. That's a heart rate variability sensor. So you put your finger in that, right? And that will give you a representation, graphical representation of the relative balance in your autonomic nervous system. So imagine that sitting on the desk of a GP. Okay, so the patient takes a reading and it gives the GP a biomarker. Now, you need to do more than one reading, but it gives some insight. So let's start tailoring antidepressants to autonomic type. So some antidepressants are more effective in parasympathetic dominance and some are more effective in sympathetic dominance. So the old tricyclics, which are all out of fashion now, they tend to be better for parasympathetic dominance. So if a GP took one of these readings from a patient and discovered that they had a parasympathetic dominant patient in front of them, you, to my mind, wouldn't prescribe an SSRI like a Prozac because you'd make them worse. By giving serotonin to a parasympathetic dominant, it pushes you further out of balance because serotonin is a parasympathetic neurotransmitter, not a sympathetic neurotransmitter like norepinephrine. So you can begin to tailor treatment by having that's like $140 or something, that device. So then you can begin to tailor antidepressants to the individual. So I'm not anti-psychiatry, but what I do know, it doesn't work for everybody. Mm-hmm. So it made me feel dreadful. It's totally ineffective for my dad. And, you know, you don't need to go very far online to realize that there's story after story after story of people in a similar position where they'll try one and then another, and they're not getting anywhere. And it's like, well, what about those guys? Mm-hmm. What can we do for them where they're drug resistant? So that's where I use nutrition and you recommend different kinds of exercise to tailor it to someone's autonomic balance, but specifically diet and natural supplements. So to go back to the story of my dad, when he was in hospital, I didn't have control over his nutrition because he was using the hospital canteen. So I brought in natural supplements, which I knew from Dr. Nicholas Gonzalez's cancer protocol helped to bring about health in his cancer patients using supplements. So I could control that aspect. So I literally would go in with a pill box full of EPA, zinc, vitamin B5, selenium, inositol, all these natural supplements that are all great supplements for parasympathetic dominance. So I diagnosed my dad as a parasympathetic dominant through his personality and physiology and all the rest of it. Then applied the supplement and dosing according to his group 3 type to boost his sympathetic nerves. So hopefully you'll be able to show some of my videos of dad, you know, pre and post this treatment, because I took video of him in hospital and then afterwards. So you'll see what a terrible health he was in. And then me giving him these natural supplements and then seeing the transformation that it made. And this is a time when normally we were dependent on electric shock therapy for him to recover.
Right. So as far as the diet is concerned,
yeah.
could you did you measure these variables? It's like, okay, we started with the diet and then added supplements to it.
Yeah.
Did you see the difference? So it didn't work, maybe just only diet, or he improved a little bit. But then when we added supplementation on top of that, that's when the aha moment came?
So we did it in the reverse order because I couldn't do nutrition first. I had to do supplements first. So we did supplements first, and I tapered them in. And I've got a diary and a score out of 10, as to how it was. It's all in the book. So I do the mental health diary in the book to show people, and with a narrative of how he was from quotes of what I was writing at the time. So tailored in his supplements first. And then, without kind of giving the end of the book away, I took control of his nutrition a couple of weeks kind of later because of something that happened. So, so it was supplements first and then nutrition. But diet really has a massive, massive effect.
Well, let's talk about that. So, regardless of whether people are on either end, like you talked about high fats and eliminating carbs, and let's talk refined sugar. Let's talk about some good fatty foods to eat, and then I want your take on caffeine and what that's about, because I was like, everyone listening, I was talking to Matt, I'm like, I'm just making a tea before the podcast, so it better be a mint. And this is just lemon and hot water.
Oh, you passed the test.
Yeah. So what about some good foods to eat?
Yeah, so on the parasympathetic side, so people that suffer from a melancholic depression, as I would call it. So there's not just one kind of depression. There's inflammatory depression where, the relationship with the microbiome, the gut lining, and that getting inflamed and causing an autoimmune response. And that then creates systemic inflammation, which also crosses the blood-brain barrier and causes an inflamed brain. And that's like an arthritic brain, which is why it slows down neurotransmission. So that's one pathway to depression. But in terms of melancholic depression, so these group 3 people, you're trying to excite the other branch of the nervous system. Really, if you're really struggling, and this happened to me not very long ago, I went straight down the butcher's and bought fatty cuts of red meat, specifically red meat. So things like braising steak that would need cooking in, say, a casserole that's too tough to cook as a steak, has a higher fat content. So I bought like a kilogram of that, plus liver. So liver's full of vitamins, which is fantastic. So I was having every single morning liver for breakfast, and red meat for dinner, fatty cuts of red meat. And I can tell you, within hours, I felt better.
Whoa.
I was, I'm vulnerable. I manage my mental health daily, absolutely on a daily basis. I know when I'm going out of balance, and thankfully I know what to do to bring myself back into balance. So it's very serious to me. I don't drink alcohol. I don't drink caffeine, no sugar, no carb. So I'm really strict, and it's through experience. My genetics are not good in this arena. Both my grandma and grandfather on my dad's side, they suffered hugely too. They both had electric shock therapy. So I have to take it seriously. So I went from a position where I was beginning to I know that feeling, the heavy limbs, the thinking slows, everything's a bit more difficult, decision-making takes longer. So thankfully, knowing what I know, it's like, right. And it's funny what I had been doing. I had in the weeks beforehand, I'd been eating much more green vegetable. So I was doing a bit of an experiment on myself, but I pushed it too far. So I was eating raw green broccoli in the weeks coming up to this episode and adding kale to my smoothie.
Yeah.
So by doing so, the fact that green vegetables are green is down to chlorophyll. And the center molecule of chlorophyll is magnesium. And magnesium blocks the sympathetic nerves. So there you go. And by having green vegetables, you're inhibiting those sympathetic nerves. And for someone like me, I push myself too far that way, bringing myself into parasympathetic dominance. As you push the sympathetic nerves down, you come into parasympathetic dominance. And that made me depressed. And I burst out crying just for no reason, bang. And I thought, right, I know what's going on. I know what I need to do. Butchers, grass-fed, red meat, fatty cuts, if possible. But also, so for 3 weeks, I ate largely carnivore for every meal.
Yeah.
So that was lots of steaks. So your rumps and your sirloins and your ribeyes. And then for sort of variety, casseroles, mince and minced beef. And, it worked a treat. It worked an absolute treat. So I brought myself back into balance. The heaviness lifted, emotional stability came back, cognitive function came back.
So once you're in balance, are you still sticking with the carnivore?
So no, I've reintroduced root vegetables. So this is where it gets a bit more complicated. So it's not as black and white as carnivore or greens or whatever. You've got to know really what to complement with. So broad spectrum, if people are wanting to get on this road, if you're finding that carnivore is helping you, but you're finding some emotional stability and you're wanting to broaden your diet, the next phase is to add root vegetables. So your sweet potatoes and your parsnips and things like that. Because they're not green, they don't contain the magnesium that green vegetables do. So you're not going to push yourself out of balance again on the parasympathetic side. So there's kind of a sequence that I work with people on. First off, eliminate refined sugars and carbs. So let's get a whole food diet first off. Let's try that for a month and see where we lie in relative balance. And what tends to happen is once you cut out all the nonsense from your diet, instinctively, you know what you want to eat. So people's own personal intuition tells you. Now, I don't know if you find this yourself, but do you ever sometimes want to have veg and sometimes want to have meat, and you instinctively just something feels as though it's going to be tasty, it's going to be better for you?
Yeah, that's so interesting because in the keto, and something I'm doing now that I'm not speaking publicly yet, but I'll talk to you after, that I craved good food. Once you're eating healthy, I didn't crave candy anymore. I didn't crave bread anymore, which was so weird to me because when you're in the middle of that, you do crave these things.
Yeah, that's
you're
right.
Right. There's the instinctual nature that you're just like, I could really go for a salad. And I've never been so pumped about a salad before.
Yeah. Well, that would be because you're leaning on the sympathetic side.
Mm-hmm.
So you're feeling as though you want to calm that branch. So salad and green leaves bring you back into balance. And then similarly, if you go the other side, you might, I fancy a steak tonight. But this goes back to the work of someone called Dr. Weston Price. So he traveled the world in the 30s and spent 8 years living in 5 continents, 14 countries, 14 different tribes. And he found that different people in different parts of the world, like native Canadians, for instance, they ate particular diets and thrived on them. But those diets were different according to which continent and which country he was in. So he established the fact that different people thrived on different diets. And one of the things that was true of all of the people that he met was none of them ate refined foods. And there was an absence of disease to the extent where there was no cancer, no heart disease, no arthritis, no Alzheimer's. They didn't, like the Eskimos, didn't even have a word for depression, even though they had, 4 hours of sunlight in the winter?
Wow.
That's crazy. I mean, that would be tough for us, wouldn't it, these days? 4 hours of sunlight. But they, of course, had an animal-based diet. Very, very high in fat. So whale blubber, seal blubber, fish and red meat. And they absolutely thrived. No mental illness whatsoever. But when their descendants moved into the towns, so go on a little bit, and the Western diet was available in the towns, of course, the carbs came in, the sugar came in. And then mental illness arrived, the cancers arrived, diabetes, obesity, heart disease. So that's a really interesting point in history where you couldn't repeat that today because, the Western diet's proliferated all communities.
Right.
But he spent 8 years doing it and wrote a 528-page book on it called Nutrition and Physical Degeneration. And it's a brilliant anthropology of food and disease. which shows that if you follow a traditional diet, you'll have absence of disease. And then, of course, you can then map, and he didn't know it at the time, but if you map on the autonomic science onto that, then we get into, oh, that's why the native Canadians thrived on that particular diet, and the people living in the high Andes thrived on a different diet, and the Eskimos thrived on a different diet. So
that is so interesting, but also makes so much sense at the same time. And I think we can go back to the point of us not being able to share this narrative to the masses, because nutrition and this kind of information just gets washed away. It's really difficult.
So you talked about caffeine before. You said you wanted to talk about caffeine
because Matt, like, that's the one thing, maybe not today, but I love coffee. Like, I was a 3-day coffee guy, and I do intermittent fasting. We could talk about that if you'd like to, if you have any info on that. Intermittent fasting has made a massive difference in how I feel over the last 6 months. I've been doing it for 6 months. Like, Matt, unbelievable energy levels, mood. And I'm just the guinea pig here. I'm just trying these different things.
So hence caffeine's the next battle, is it? Next hurdle.
Well, I haven't had caffeine, and this is day 13. And
okay, headache?
The first 5 days,
Yeah, I had two weeks of headache. I find it hard. So I haven't had caffeine for probably 2-3 years. I love coffee.
I love 2-3 years.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So it's another excitatory factor. So again, it's exciting the sympathetic branch. It's sending you out of balance, and it's sending you on a wave, and follow the wave. After the wave comes the crash. Mm-hmm. So then you come into the craving, and your body sends a signal. Once the caffeine's come out of your body, can take 8 hours for the full amount of caffeine to get out of your body. So think about that before bedtime, of how long that takes to get out if you want to get to sleep. But it's a very similar story to sugar, where you get a high, you get a blood sugar lift, and then you get a crash, and your body sends a distress signal. So it sends an adrenaline signal of feed me. I'm in a underfueled state, because the brain's natural choice is to go for glucose above fats as its primary fuel source. So when you go carnivore keto, you're changing that, because your body obviously switches to ketone. But normally, for most people, probably in the Western world, they're burning a lot of sugar. And it's the same with caffeine. So after the rise comes the fall, then comes the distress signal. And guess what? In the UK, there's over 8 million recorded cases of anxiety now with people suffering from anxiety. Well, some of that is just blood sugar imbalance. So when you crash and you come down to low blood sugar, your body feels shaky, tense, you sweat, adrenaline's running, noradrenaline's running in the brain. So what do? You head for something, you take something out of the fridge, you go for another coffee, lactose, sugar in milk, in coffees. So you go for another one, which stabilizes you for a bit. And then 90 minutes later, I feel a bit edgy.
Right.
So there you go. That's the sugar. That's the cycle with both, the caffeine and the sugar.
I'm amazed that people haven't, like, I ask in case people deal with anxiety, I'm like, do you drink coffee? They're like, yeah. Have you tried quitting? No. There's the education part needs to like, this goes back to, we could talk about how terrible nutrition science and just our education is, starting in elementary school, going into high school, and we're still learning about the food groups, and dairy's on that list to still have get your calcium from dairy. What's your thoughts on dairy as well? How does that affect the nervous system?
Yeah, so it's an inflammatory, unless it's raw, which I think is probably not available too much in Canada, for instance. You can get it in farms in the UK, so unpasteurized, unhomogenized milk. But for the typical milk that people will buy in the supermarket, that's full of lactose and casein. So that's an inflammatory. So again, that affects the microbiome and the inflammation of the gut lining, creates little tears, microscopic tears in the gut lining, and that sets up your autoimmune response, because the body sees that as a threat. So it circulates cytokines, which are our inflammatory markers. and you get systemic inflammation, and then you get this issue with the inflammation crossing the blood-brain barrier, and then your neurotransmission is affected. So that's where there's the link between that and mental illness. So
the leaky gut, we call it the leaky gut, right?
Leaky gut, basically. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So if you, I mean, I've eliminated all of that. So for butter, for instance, because it affects things like cooking. So I make ghee. So ghee is like purified butter. So it's very simple. You can either buy it for like 3 times the price, or just go and buy organic grass-fed butter, which is not expensive, from your supermarket. And then you essentially bring it to the boil. And then there's like a scum appears on the top of the butter. So it goes to liquid form, fully liquid. There's a scum, like a white layer of scum appears on the top. And then you siphon that off or put it through a muslin cloth. And then you've got this beautiful ghee, liquid golden ghee. And then you let that set like overnight. And then you've got beautiful ghee that you use in your cooking. So that's what I use as a basis. So I don't use vegetable oils. That's another one that's terrible. Vegetable oils, avoid.
Yes.
Inflammatory.
That's right. So with canola oil, vegetable oils, these are very processed oils.
Yes, very bad.
How are they squeezing fat out of these vegetables?
Yeah, well, funnily enough, they're not vegetables, are they? They're seeds.
They're seeds.
Sunflower seed isn't a vegetable, it's a seed. So even the name isn't correct. But yeah, they're highly refined, highly processed. So if you wanted to see it in its unrefined form, it would be a horrible gray liquid. Wouldn't that look nice on the supermarket shelf? So that's why they have to prettify it by putting it through a chemical process.
Right.
But it's very inflammatory. So I would suggest people don't go anywhere near it.
So a big trend, it's been around a while, but like coconuts had a huge comeback in recent years. Just like avocados and coconut oil still, able to deal with fairly high temperatures, right? Or is that
absolutely. It's a good choice. It's a good choice. Yes, it is very much so. So coconut oil, there's like a few noises out there. I don't know who's funding the research, but I question it about, is coconut oil bad for you? But no, it's not. It's very good for you. And load it up. It doesn't make you fat. It fuels the brain. So I'll alternate. So I'll use ghee and heat that in frying foods. So a steak, or I use dripping now, so beef dripping.
What's beef dripping?
So it's from a cow, basically. And then you can use tallow from, I think Michaela uses tallow for her cooking, she said.
There are these, I was looking, there's a Kickstarter for like these carnivore bars I wanted to try.
Right.
Because snacking, for me, like in between meals with intermittent fasting, I don't want to keep making big meals and big meals.
Yeah.
So these, like, do you deal with, snacking cravings at all, or are you pretty satiated through the day?
Yeah, pretty good, because of the fact that I have a high healthy fat breakfast. I can go 7 hours, but if I do need to snack on something, I've got a dehydrator, so I'll put thin cuts of beef in the dehydrator and then put it in the fridge or even freezer, and then snack on that. So you're getting your supply of all your nice precursors to neurotransmitters that way, and fueling your brain again with healthy saturated fats to keep you going. In the day, and you're wanting to work or whatever, you've got to fuel your brain with something that's going to give you good cognitive function, and that's one way of doing it. So I avoid fruits. So as a parasympathetic dominant like I am, fruits aren't good for me, which is, you think apples, that's an obvious choice, but not for my food group. So yeah, I stick to high fat foods like that.
Because of this profile that you have for parasympathetic dominant. Okay, so if
absolutely.
we move to the other side of someone who's sympathetic dominant, let me just make sure I get this right. So those are the CEOs?
That's right.
Well, those are the CEOs.
Taking over the world.
High energy, making all the money, not sharing it with me. So those are the people that are more, let's have a salad and that'll satiate me and calm me down.
Absolutely. So they're your green vegetable type people. So Dr. Gonzalez would do this for cancer. So he would assign the diet in a cancer patient. So your type A's, they get tumor-based cancers pretty exclusively. and parasympathetic dominants get blood-borne cancers. So he would typically know by the person walking through the door, if they've got breast cancer, there'll be a group 1 sympathetic dominant. If they've got leukemia, there'd be a group 3 parasympathetic dominant. So therefore, he would know which supplements and which nutritional protocol to put them on to balance the autonomic nervous system. And he's got results that will blow any other doctor, any oncologist out of the water. Remarkable outcomes.
Unbelievable for a lot of people.
Yeah, I mean, you'd like pancreatic cancer. I volunteered at a cancer charity, so I know a bit about it. Stage 4 pancreatic cancer typically has a 3 to 6 month life expectancy. He's got a 32-year post-diagnosis diagnosed pancreatic cancer.
What? Alive
today. Yeah.
Whoa.
I know. Remarkable guy.
Again, it's the availability. The information's available, but maybe not advertised enough.
No, and I had to go on a really deep dive, from a point of view where we were desperate when Dad was in hospital and we didn't have his regular treatment available, and which has lots of side effects, as well. So you don't want him to be having electric shock therapy. It destroys memory, for instance. But, there we are, the 7th time he's been hospitalized and he can't have his treatment. It's like, where do we go from here? So I went on a very deep dive, and that's for someone with scientific training as well. For the average person, where do you go?
Right.
You hit Google.
It's daunting.
It's very hard for people.
Yeah. Well, that's, I think, the issue here too for those who are feeling depressed. It's like, if stigma wasn't even a thing, who cares about all that? Let's say. Well, then they ask themselves, well, where the heck do I start? I'll go to my GP, I get an antidepressant, but what's an antidepressant? I'm scared to take a pill. Then I'm getting the side effects. So it's really hard to know where to start, which is why what you're doing, Matt, is amazing.
Well, I'm trying. So it's,
that's all you can do.
It's, and I do speaking events and wrote the book. So because of the outcome of the story, which I'm kind of not going to try and not give the game away with the book.
Keep them in suspense.
Yeah, my next instinct was, look, people have got to know about this. So my instinct, because of my training, was, should I write a scientific paper or approach it scientifically, do a partnership with the scientific community or a company or something? And I thought, I think I learned my lesson through other doctors who have tried to challenge the existing paradigm. And I thought, no, my voice just won't be heard. So I thought, no, rather than do that, I'm going to write a personal narrative. I'm going to write a personal story where the human interest is so compelling that people will want to read that story. And hopefully the human interest story gets heard and shared. And off the back of that story, which is, it's very emotional, it's very engaging, there's a lot of suffering, but there's also redemption, comes the science. You can tell the science off the back of the personal narrative, which I think makes it land better rather than just me beating the drum saying, do this and do that.
Way more accessible.
It's much more accessible. Yeah, I think so. So that's been the journey. And it was published in October last year. So it's relatively early in its life. So doing things like this and doing public speaking events, and doing mental health in the workplace. So I work with companies too to help their employees with mental health, giving them mentoring and nutritional advice and advice about exercise, like we talked about, to tailor it to the individual, and just trying to plug away, get the word out there, educate people so that they can make an informed choice. Because I've gone from a position where I had no control over my mental health. And I used to swing, blow in the wind according to the stresses placed upon me. And my career has been interrupted more than once. Big jobs interrupted very badly by mental illness. I had no control. Whereas now, I don't need a doctor. I'm in control. I'm very careful about what I put into my body. And I'm healthy. I don't take any antidepressants. So if other people can become educated and take control back over their health, which is entirely possible for everybody, wouldn't be that be great if people were empowered to that degree where they didn't need a doctor, and they could just be careful about what they ate, the type of exercise they did, the stimulants that they took, and the choices that they made through things like alcohol or caffeine to regain balance. And for people like me who are vulnerable, it's not a game. It becomes serious.
Well, literally 1 cup of coffee can throw you off for a little bit.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful and stay on top of it. But if you do that cost benefit analysis, it's worth it. Be careful, as I'm sure you agree.
Yeah.
Wow.
Well, you only need to learn once, don't you, really, that it goes the other way.
Yes.
And if in the pit of depression, you think, well, was it worth it?
Exactly. And the answer is 9 out of 10 times no. Was it worth 6 beers in a night?
Yeah.
Oh,
no, it wasn't.
I'm out for a week. I don't think so. The night wasn't that fun. Matt, I'd like to, a tradition here on the podcast is to, I'll mute my mic. And any last messages that you want to give to the audience, anything you'd like, everyone, Matt's links, everything you need is in the bio. And you can plug anything you'd like. I know you mentioned the free courses, which is amazing during this time of COVID-19.
Yeah.
So the microphone is yours.
Yeah. So the first thing I'd like people that are watching or listening to this to know would be, you do have control over this. So you might have been knocked for 6 by anxiety, depression, but my experience and my training shows that you don't need to be at the mercy of this illness. You can get better. So there is a great story of hope here by taking personal responsibility and just getting to know the foundations of what you can do to help yourself. I think, this is a really important time now. The internet has opened up a whole new opportunity for people to become self-educated. And I think this is just one of those things that is going to empower people hugely to take power back to themselves and take control over their health. So, I'm really, really hopeful that it's not expensive. You don't need to go and visit somebody else to do this. It's perfectly within your power once you've got the knowledge. And take back control. So the course you mentioned during this, terrible, difficult time for people, I'm sure it's having a big effect on mental health. I've done a 38 video course, which is all about mental health. And I've made it free during this time of the coronavirus. So if people want to navigate to thethrivecourse.com, they can watch the videos at their own leisure, do as many times as you like. And it tells you the science. It goes a bit deeper into some of the stuff we talked about today. And then some practical tools so that you can regain balance. And there's all sorts of other stuff in there too, but have a dive in, and hopefully it can help some people.
Matt, that's incredible. This was one amazing hour. I thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
So great. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Thank you, listeners, for tuning in. Stay strong. There's always hope. You have control, as Matt said. Keep being you and express yourself. Take care.